Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this first session after lunch. This is the second of these educational track sessions. And so the basic idea of these is a little different to the traditional workshop in EuroDIG. It's a bit more about providing some, educational content, I guess, some background material for all of us to go forward and take part in other discussions that are happening at this event and elsewhere. The topic for this one is cybersecurity. And so the way we've done it, well, let me start, I guess, a sort of thematic summary of this. There was an article that Cory Doctorow wrote yesterday talking a bit about Theresa May's recent comments and plans for regulating the internet. And he quoted Aaron Swartz, who is an activist who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And the quote was, "It's no longer okay not to understand how the internet works." And that was aimed at policymakers, lawyers, politicians, everyone who actually is looking at making policy and regulation about the internet. It's absolutely vital that they have an underlying understanding of what's actually happening on the internet, how we're actually using that technology, what it's doing when it's transferring information from one place to another. And so that's the point of what we're doing here today. My name's Chris Buckridge. I'm sort of moderator. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot for me to do beyond this introduction. But I work for the RIPE NCC. We're regional internet registry for this part of the world and also a general secretariat for the RIPE community, which is an open community of people interested in IP addressing and networking. And we have a few others from that RIPE community actually here with us today, who will all be presenting on some slightly different aspects of technical realities behind the sort of cybersecurity headlines. That's how we've framed this. So we have Patrick Feldstrom, who's from NetNode. You probably recognize him from any other number of internet governance-y sort of events. We have Marco Hochwoning, who's my colleague from RIPE NCC, Marilyn Bunthaus from ECP, and Peter Koch from DNIC. And so each of them will have a bit of a brief presentation looking at, well, I guess the question, how does cybersecurity work? What we also hope then to have is a bit of an open microphone session where, as we've framed it here, you can ask an expert. Basically, if you've got questions about cybersecurity issues, and there have certainly been plenty of those issues in the news recently that may have led you to have questions, we have a pretty gun team here of experts who should be able to provide some perspective on those issues from a technical background. So with that, I'll dive straight in and let Patrick take over.
Okay, thank you very much. Should I have that thing?
There you go.
There. This is cool, you know, sort of, as an engineer, you still screw up how you use these kind of things. These good guys, they put tape over here, so there's actually only one button I can use. And I used the wrong one. Okay. When we discussed what I was going to talk about, of course, I could talk about some more operational issues, but I was actually thinking about taking one step ahead and not even talking about an operational issues. I'm going to talk about what is behind some of the operational issues. So what I'm going to talk about is time and frequency. And as one of the building blocks that we have to use to get a stable and well-functioning internet. Because as I will sort of talk about in a bit, it's quite important to understand and know when something happened. So first, NetNode, where I work, what are we doing? We do internet connect points in Copenhagen, Oslo, Stockholm, and a few other places in Sweden. We run DNS in about 75 locations in the world. We run a root server, run DNS for maybe 20, 30 CCTLDs. And then we run the time and frequency in 4 locations, in Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, Sundsvall, and the 5th place. And I'm going to also describe what we really are doing and why we're doing it. So this picture, I was an advisor to the Swedish IT minister for 12 years, something like that, 11 years. And this is from the Prime Minister's office in Stockholm. And you don't have to know much about time, and you understand there is something wrong in this picture, right? I actually just took a picture of the clock that you have done in the hotel reception here. It's a little bit better than this, but not much. have a look at it. It's actually kind of fun. So when seeing various different kind of things like this make you either sort of ask what is going on, or you might actually be very interested in and what this time thing actually is. So the question is then, what is time? Time consists of two parts. One is something that ticks. You have something that ticks once every second, 10,000 times a second. However, you need to know, of course, how often this is supposed to tick, because the second thing you need is a counter that counts how many ticks there is. Okay? So a clock is, to some degree, really easy, something that ticks and something that counts. And for the people that are sort of understand how these two things together, understand that, okay, there are some problems with this, because first of all, you need something that ticks exactly the same speed as other things that ticks. Two clocks have to be sort of in sync with each other. The other important thing is that when you start that ticking thing, you need to know what number you are start counting at. Okay, so you have a bootstrap problem when in the counter. But if you figure that out, and you have something that ticks very precisely, and you have a counter, and you bootstrap the counter at the correct number, then you have a very precise clock. It's not more difficult than that. So, like, how hard can it be? Well, there are actually two different things we have to look at when we look at various different kind of measurements. And this goes back to, in general, sort of security issues and knowing what happened. One is to look at accuracy, and one to look at precision. And of course, it might be the case that you have low accuracy but very high precision, which means that all the numbers you have are approximately the same, but they are wrong. Okay? Or you might have things that are up there to the left, something that is approximately right, but they're all over the place, but the medium is actually, the mean value is correct. What we want is, of course, that. We want something that is relatively precise, but also accurate. And when you start to try to do something in the correct way, regardless of what it is, sometimes you need to actually choose whether you want accuracy or precision. And if it is the case that you go into sort of the nerdiness of clocks and other kind of things, this is where there is a difference between hydrogen masers and cesium and rubidium, whether this is short-term or long-term, but that's sort of detail that I will not go into. So the next question, of course, is why is it important that this time thing is correct? Why do we know what time? Okay, all of us, we are very social people, all of us in the room. And after long experiments, I understood that when two persons are going to meet, it's very important that the accuracy that our clocks, for example, my clock and Marcus' clock, they cannot be wrong more than 15 minutes. And the question is then, why 15 minutes? Well, this is actually kind of easy. If we decide to go to, this is my favorite restaurant in Stockholm, Brasserie Godot, by the way. So if we decide to go there and meet, there are actually, we need to know the geographical location, 3 dimensions, or maybe 2, but anyways, we need to agree on the restaurant, and at what time we're going to meet. And now, if it is the case that our clocks go like that there is an error or they are very different, I figured out after many years of sort of knowing Marco that the person that comes there first order a beer, and after 50 minutes that beer is out, and then there's a risk that the person leaves. So you have about sort of 1 beer, which is approximately 15 minutes. That is sort of the maximum error. But the real problem that we have is when you have events that happens in a distributed system, you have various events, and each one of them get a timestamp. And then when specifically if these timestamps are done, for example, in different servers, or in different computers, or in different locations, you later on would like to know in what order those events happened in this distributed system. And if those events happens, for example, once every second, we all can understand it's pretty important that the time difference, the time difference between the clocks in these various systems that do the timestamps must be more accurate than 1 second. And of course, also quite precise. So the overall question that you try to answer quite often when dealing with these kind of security issues is in what order events took place. And the question is, well, is this a cyber or computer issue? Well, yes, it is to some degree, but we also have a problem in the real world itself, because unfortunately, we could not agree on what time it is. So this is just one example of a list of various timescales. And if we compare the various timescales, we see that there's a difference between GPS and TAI. We have a difference between GPS and UTC. And we know that there's a difference between UTC and TAI. And it's also the case that the difference varies because we have leap seconds. So one of the first things we need to do when dealing with time is not only to make sure that things are accurate and precise, we also need to know what timescale we are going to use. And how do you know what timescale it is? Most people think that we're using UTC. Yes, we are using UTC, but unfortunately, UTC is something that is created as a mean between clocks of maybe 40 different national institutes, and each one of the institutes get to know how wrong their time was compared to UTC 1 month behind in time. So they get a letter every month saying, your clock last month was had this much error. So you have to sort of extrapolate forward. This scale here you have between each line is 100 days. So this is a modified Julian date, so you cannot read this. So not even I can read it. 57,100, 57,200, 100 days between each one of them. These are the number of nanoseconds, and this is the difference between the Swedish official time and UTC. And what you should know here, so you see that it varies between, let's say, plus 13 and minus 28 nanoseconds. And people might think, okay, that's not so much. Well, GPS differ from UTC with approximately 34 to 40 nanoseconds, plus minus. So they are two different, so you follow either UTC or you follow GPS. It is also the case that in 5G, mobile standard, the clocks needs to be more accurate and more precise than 100 nanoseconds. So we start to go into, so it is the case that with the 5G standard, we start to go into sort of the same number range, which is the difference between these different time standards. We at NetNode, we follow the Swedish time standard, the Swedish time UTC SP. We don't follow UTC, we don't follow GPS. And we are approximately within 10 nanoseconds if things work well. So how come this is important? We have a couple of cases in Sweden where, for example, you have this, normally nowadays you have electronic-based procurement processes, and you log into a computer, you go to a web page, and you sort of submit your bid before a certain point in time. We have a case where the public procurement was quite a lot of money. The time in the computer was 7 minutes too fast. So the computer actually stopped the ability to submit procurement, sort of input to the procurement 7 minutes too early. That was not good. It's also the case that there was a response with an RFP that was sent via fax. And as you all remember, those of you who remember fax, you had a timestamp at the top of the paper. That timestamp was the clock in the fax, which of course was as accurate as this sort of VCR that and microwave one we have at home that just blinks all the time. But they actually used the timestamp of the phone call, brought it to court, and the court did put down the case. So they didn't make a verdict because there was no definition in the RFP itself what timescale should be, the actual timestamp when the RFP should be delivered. It's also the case that we had the Swedish foreign minister that was murdered, stabbed to death in a department store in Stockholm in 2003, I think. And they had lots of surveillance cameras in that department store, but just because the clock was different in the different cameras, they took 3 days to understand how the murderer was running around in the department store. That delayed the ability to actually track down who was the murderer. It's also the case that in Stockholm we have fees for what we call it high occupancy road fees around Stockholm, and the fee that you pay differs depending on what time it is. But someone actually challenged the decision that was made for the fee, and that was kind of interesting because they didn't really know what time it was. So if it is the case you drive by one of those cameras or you have illegal parking or something close to when the time zone sort of challenged that, it was actually kind of interesting. If we look at more seriously, we have a legislation in Sweden from 1736 that we are still using, and it's one of the oldest legislations we have. And this legislation says, if it is the case that you sell the same goods twice, in that case, whoever bought the goods first keeps it. So since 1736, in Sweden it has been sort of by law, you need to keep track of when transaction takes place. A little bit more recent, there was an article in the Times, 9th of May 2017, and they pointed out that in the financial industry nowadays, it's actually kind of popular to do denial of service attacks against GPS receivers close to when you have certain things happening on the stock market, because people hope that their competitor, because you block the GPS, will have issues with the timestamps and will not really know when to actually sell and do the deals. So you get an advantage if it is the case that you block your competitor's GPS receiver. Kind of interesting. Really good article. So this says here is that the financial firms are fighting back and the attackers interfere with the GPS signal. And we have seen a lot of sort of jamming of the GPS signal for quite a large number of years, but lately we have also seen, and I claim it's because of Pokemon, you also seen people do replay attacks on GPS because people don't have enough energy to actually walk around. Instead, you have a replayer of GPS signals so that the phone, the software in the phone, the Pokemon software, believe that you actually are walking around and you can collect all Pokemons you want. Kind of innovative. So on the financial market, they also have new requirements from 3rd of January 2018, which says that if it is the case that you do some trading based on voice, that you call a trader, the trading company need to have a timestamp that is accurate to 1 second. If it is the case to have email or SMS-based communication, the trader need to have accuracy up to 1 millisecond. And if it is the case to have some kind of auto trading, it must be 10 to the power minus 4 seconds accuracy and precision, which also means, of course, that not only do the clock need to be that precise of the trader, it's also the case that you need to also have an evidence package, an evidence log that explains what the actual error was. In 5G, as I said, it's about 100 nanoseconds precision that is required. No one really knows why, but that is sort of something that all the manufacturers have designed their gears about, including us. So we have a precision of about 10 nanoseconds for our system. We can ignore that part. So how do you do this? So what does a clock look like nowadays? Not really like what's on the wall downstairs or on my arm. This is what a node looks like with 2 clocks. In reality, you have the thing that ticks down here, and then you have some adjustments for the ticking, and then you have counters higher up. That's basically how it works. And in each one of the nodes, we have 2 clocks, an A and a B clock. So that if one of the ticks stop, in that case, we start to use the other ticking box. So you have the frequency and phase management, you have the P2P and satellite thing, NTP servers, some measurements, and web computers, routers, and switches. That's basically how it works. So what you do is that you have a cesium clocks, you generate a 10 megahertz pulse, you adjust the pulse so that it's within the 10 nanoseconds of precision, so you do a phase shift and delay, and then you have a frequency distribution amplifier, you have a measurement unit that makes sure that everything is correct, that also feedbacks the adjustment mechanism. And then when you have a very precise pulse, then you feed your NTP and P2P server that everyone is looking at. So another interesting thing is that, as all of you know, a signal within a fiber or something, 1 nanosecond is about 1 foot. So when I talk about having sort of 10 nanoseconds of error, what you have to do is that you measure all cables in seconds, because that's a propagation delay of the signal. You mark all the cables very precisely, and then you configure the system according to what cable lengths are, so you can compensate for the length of the cables to be able to get the precision accurate enough. One of the things, the only thing we really had to do was to develop a hardware-based NTP server to be able to respond to NTP queries over the internet. But that is done. And also we made a daughter card so you can measure, not only control the NTP server, but also measure how it works. And then, of course, compare with some of the satellites in the GPS system. And one of the things that happened was that there was actually a bug in one of the software releases in the GPS satellite. So there was an error in January last year. But we and a few others had collected data, so we could actually help debugging the software in the satellites that created some issues. So we also do measurements and comparison with the satellites. So this is basically what it looks like for people interested. And this is a whole system. So this is one node, 2 clocks, not so different at all. If you're interested in time, what's really interesting is actually go back and look at, for example, this one. Once upon a time before GPS, it was actually pretty difficult to know where you were, what the longitude you were. So you had to have very precise clocks to measure where you were, compare with the position of the sun, and you could calculate the longitude. So it's kind of an interesting story. That's all. Thank you.
So I'll quickly just say, we do want to sort of keep moving with the other presentations, but I think if there is anyone who has sort of specific questions for Patrick about the issues here or the ticking boxes, now would be a time if you want to speak now. Okay.
Speak loud. Patrick, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. And concerning the Galileo system, let's say the positioning system developing in Europe.
Personally, I think it's very, very sad that the Galileo system is so similar to the GPS system. It has exactly the same kind of weaknesses. And which I mean by similar is that you have approximately the same kind of math behind it, and you do the same kind of triangulation and calculation of the positions. So Galileo is to some degree, it's a competitor regarding implementation of basically the same kind of system. And because of that, Galileo is better because it's more modern. But it's not a different system than GPS. If you look at for example, Baidu, the Chinese system, or if you look at the Russian system, they are much more different. So people like us, we could sort of use GPS or Galileo, and then we compare with one of the other systems like Baidu, for example. So I would have liked it to be different. On the other hand, GPS is so worldwide sort of in use. So of course, it's also convenient that Galileo is similar to GPS because it's very easy to transition from GPS to Galileo, which is a much, much more modern system. But to take a step back, from our perspective and the regulator in Sweden that asked us to do this, the largest problem is that any kind of distribution of important information like time signal over radio is not something you can rely on in the case of an attack. Jamming radio signals is extremely common, so you cannot really rely on radio for any kind of communication in the case of a disaster.
You want to say anything? I've got one question to your right-hand side.
A very dumb question from a dummy. I understand this is extremely important. Precision is extremely important. How difficult is it to tamper with it from the outside? Can I just hack it?
If it is the case that this is one of the reasons why you should not use radio. If it is the case that you're going to hack something, in that case you need to have access to the cable. So that's one way of securing a system. Regarding our system, no, you cannot access it from the outside. The internal system of the internal system itself, you cannot hack just because of how you certain things in the system you need to walk there physically, and the boxes themselves are down in bunkers, which are sort of on secret locations in Sweden. That said, there is a reason why we have 2 clocks in each node, because if you tamper with one, the system itself will detect in the measurement that there is too large difference, so the system will shut itself down. There is also a reason why there are 4 or 5 different nodes we use, because we compare with each other, and we also compare with GPS and Galileo and the other satellite systems, and each one of the systems will detect if there is a tampered with and turn itself off if that happens. So over and over again, not only here, but also otherwise, we'll probably come back to that. Redundancy is very important regarding resilience and security issues.
that gives me a nice bridge. And I don't have slides. Hello, my name is Marco. I work for the RIPE NCC, and yes, I usually describe my job. I sit between the technology and everything else. And talking about between, yeah, how easy is it to tamper with? And I know Peter for quite a long time, and I know a bit about the topic. Imagine jamming a GPS signal. Getting a clock of a GPS signal off is a matter of a tactically placed piece of aluminum foil. That's basically, it's 20 cents worth of aluminum foil at the right window or at the right angle, and that's your GPS clock gone to the point where you won't have accuracy, at least not in the nanosecond range you were aiming for. Which brings me kind of to the point I was driving, or wanted to drive here, is we see cybersecurity as a technical problem. It's always about technology. Oh, somebody made a mistake. And as Patrick said, you can secure systems, you can build them tamper-proof, you can build a bunker, put your clock in, you put a second clock next to it. There is a cost associated with it. And that's the point, is it's not only about building such an accurate time system, it's also about the willingness to connect it up. Because despite all your efforts, is the clock in the Swedish Prime Minister's office now fixed? Is it now sort of digital and hooked up to your system and actually showing an accurate timestamp? Or is that probably still those cheap battery-fed things that once every few weeks somebody might think like adjust it?
It is still the old clocks, but we are close to actually fixing the problem.
You go down there every week and reset them more. Because that's often what we do. We just go down there and push the button. If something fails, it crashed. Reset, try again. How many of you, I'm not sure, how many of you are old enough to remember Slammer? 2001, 2002? A few. WannaCry? Yeah, we've all seen those headlines, eh? Used the exact same protocol transport. 16 years in. Okay, it exploited a different hole in software because meanwhile the software did progress a bit, but it used the same protocol transport. Nothing really changed. We just fell in that hole again. And again, WannaCry was, well, I call it a blessing in disguise. Actually, WannaCry was great marketing. That's what I love. It's all of a sudden it was so visible. Everybody was like, oh, cybersecurity. And then they're looking at technical solutions. Well, the technical solution was right there. You should have applied that patch that Microsoft made available 3 months ago. And Microsoft only made it available because somebody actually found out that a government was sitting on the information that made the whole possible. But let's not go there immediately. So yeah, back to my point. It's you. Or basically it's us humans. Of course we can build technical solutions to a lot of problems, but it's also about the willingness to apply. And I think that also here, again, this is kind of pushed when we started putting this session together. It's like, oh yeah, explain us how the internet works and explain technology. And it's really important to understand how things work. And that's also glad that Patrick put a bit of a light on, like, yeah, how important is it to get time accuracy and how difficult it is. Of course, we can build it, but you kind of have to use it. I'm more than happy to discuss with people very high-end technical solutions to make cyberspace more secure. But what's the odd chance that you're going to pay for that? And what's the odd chance that you actually are going to deploy those patches? Because there's always a risk in there, yes, but not doing it is also a risk. So I kind of want to leave it to there. I can go much further into details, but yeah, it's realize what we have is not only a technological problem, and I would actually almost say like the shame that we don't have a psychological expert or somebody in human behavioral sciences behind the desk, because I think that's very often missing from the whole cybersecurity space.
Okay, maybe it's best to just power straight on through with Marilyn and your.
I think so, because a better bridge I couldn't have, because I'm not a psychologist, but maybe I'm the alpha. I don't know. I'm not the expert, the technical expert at the desk. but maybe the awareness expert. Because you speak about willingness, Marco, but what about knowing? How are your skills, your technical skills? Because I think there's a lack as well sometimes. And I really want to make this call. Don't stop and teach yourself, because there is where it all starts. Secondly, it's not only you who has to know what to do, but you have to teach your surrounding as well. The people at work, your employees, but most important as well, your spokesman. But your spokesman, if he doesn't know if the incident is about ransomware or a DDoS attack or phishing, and he speaks to journalists or to politicians, what about their skills? Because we need to teach all of them as well if we want to make steps forward. And at least, so teach each other is very, very important, I think. And then we have, doesn't work with me as well. Then we have to teach kids as well. And it's not about 1 hour coding a year. Because if you have the skills, at schools, we don't live all in Estonia, where they start with coding and robotica at primary school. At least it's not that case in the Netherlands. So we need skilled people to go to schools and teach our children if we want to increase the knowledge in our countries, and we want to have more skilled people in jobs in a short time and not about 30 years or something. Then I have another call. Well, not this one. I will come up to that maybe. But it's about campaigning. Because we talk about campaigning, is it useful anymore? Don't we have to stop because we don't listen? We all react reactive. If there's an incident, then we go on and do something about it. But isn't it about knowing what to do? So if there's something happening, so I think we don't need to stop with campaigning. We take small steps every time we have a campaign. You know about the Cybersecurity Month in Europe, and I think it's in the States as well. And we have 2 weeks of, well, it's called Alert Online in the Netherlands, in 2 weeks with a lot of, I think last year we had 150 companies joining this campaign. One is making a newsletter for their employees. Others are doing something for their clients. But a lot of companies joining actually, the community, we make some press results, and it works because for example, 2 years ago, I talked with Schiphol Airport. I didn't feel like doing something about cybersecurity. Didn't care in campaigning. Well, behind the scenes, of course, but not for their employees. And then last year, the marketing people called me and they said, well, it's very good, the effort you made with Alert Online, because this year we joined the campaign, and actually we're going to start with a campaign all year around to teach our employees. And I think it works. And at least it works that people know when an incident is happening. When we read about WannaCry, people know that, well, it's us. We have to teach ourselves and we have to make a change. So I showed you this. It's not exactly maybe for you at work, but this is a campaign. It's an example of a successful campaign. It was made in the InSafe network for families. It was made by Ogilvy for the German InSafe network about 10 years ago. I don't know, David was here, but 8, 9 years ago. It was translated in a lot of languages, and it still works today. So I show it to you just as an example, because I really like to know from you, if we talk about campaigning inside or outside your networks or your company, what works, what are best practices, and what didn't work, because we can learn from each other from that way as well. So, does it work? Oh, few minutes, I talk. I do the last, because I had this slide of power of repeating, and I think that says it all. Maybe it works.
Schmidt, Peters, Jansen, Hermanns. Is your son home?
Yes, he's up in his room. Come in.
Hi, is Klausy here?
Yeah, upstairs.
Well then, we'll go up and try out some kinky stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Cool location.
Where's Klaus?
There.
Good afternoon.
Oh, hello.
Is this little Anna? You've got a nice bunny. Come on, I'll show you a real bunny.
In real life, you would protect your children. So why not protect them on the internet?
Well, this is a campaign. It's 10 years old. It doesn't have any solutions in it, no technical. It doesn't help us what to do, but at least it can show you that this campaign, 10 years old, is still actual today. So this last call to you, don't go home. Don't stop, teach yourself and teach your, well, everybody around you.
Okay, before we throw to Peter, maybe it's good to just sort of take a second and see if anyone has any questions either from Marco's input or Mariline's presentation there. Yep. Perhaps can we pass the mic across to Owen there? Oh, there, okay.
Just to come back on the point that Marco made, is more of an observation than a question. That I think it's interesting when we talk about that this cybersecurity is not necessarily a technical problem, but it's more something a bit broader than that. I think that's why, for instance, you see more and more policymakers looking at how to enhance cybersecurity resilience by actually mandating it by law. And so you had recently the NIS directive at European level, which basically forced companies who might not necessarily currently implement proper cybersecurity to actually do so. And I think now with the recent ransomware attack, you'll see more and more of trying to mandate providers to enforce more cybersecurity standards.
May I first? Sometimes great initiatives. The problem with most of the laws, they are very reactive. Even, I mean, the biggest threat you get from this directive and the biggest threat you get from GDPR is you will get a fine if you screw it up. And that kind of puts people in, it might help in that it puts a price on not doing security, which might incentivize people to invest more in proactive security. But it's still a trade-off. And at some point, it's the famous Ford Pinto problem. How much do I spend in preventing disaster and how much will cost it when it happens? And I would really like to step people beyond that mindset. Because the real cheap thing is just to, well, it's not cheap, but in the long run, is like Marjolein said, educate people, build quality products, and be willing to pay the price for such quality projects, and we don't need that law.
Thank you. It's good that you started, not me. It's a comment regarding the NIS directive. I think one of the problems with the NIS directive is that it is focusing not so much on people doing the right thing. It's focusing on requirements that you should report whenever you think that you have a security incident. Okay? How many people in a market-based economy that have competitors do you think will tell the truth all the time? And, for example, not lie or not try to tell the truth. So first of all, the successful certs, for example, that we see around the world, they are the ones that are built bottom up by having organizations see the need for coordination of various different kind of incidents, so that, and having the certs give back and produce public reports. Because the goal here with the cert, and the reason why people should report, is that by reporting what happened, the cert can produce a report back to you and to others, so that you can learn without actually being the target of an incident yourself. So you learn from each other. That is the overall goal, and that is what a functioning cert is doing. And I think that is completely forgotten in the NIS directive, which means the reporting back, the requirement on whoever receives the report to actually produce for the market valuable data. That is not there. The second thing, which is unfortunate in the NIS directive, is that it's not harmonized with the Electronic Communication Directive. I think the goal was originally that either you are covered by the Electronic Communication Directive and you report incidents according to that report channel, or you report according to the NIS directive. But that is not how the NIS directive is written, and for example in Sweden there are certain organizations that actually have to report twice as the proposal of implementation is. So I think there are lots of things that could have been done better in the NIS directive. But on the other hand, it's on its way to be implemented all around Europe, and let's hope on the best. But the number one thing, a well-functioning cert primarily produces good reports. And then if they produce good reports, they can use the need for good reporting to them as an argument to actually get data. Carrot and the stick. Don't always lean and use the stick. Thank you. Sorry for being so long, but I have some emotional feelings there, as you notice.
Shall I pass it down? Any other questions
Any
so
other
far?
emotional responses?
Well, a non-emotional response, but it was mentioned before in the year 2001, I think. There's already something looking quite similar like WannaCry right now. Actually, business already had an announced dress rehearsal for a security incident, which was the Y2K bug. And actually, so the Y2K bug, this is the year 2000 incident, where many of older softwares were obsolete because there were just leading zeros missing in dates. But this was the moment where everybody agreed that something had to be done, and actually major companies really set up for the first time really competitive and useful procedures how to handle future incidents. The funny thing is, this apparently is quite forgotten nowadays, although most certainly most today's security policies in major companies go back to the Y2K bug.
Fair point. It cost a lot of people to test their software. That was a unique event. Yet my technical brain then says everybody touched age-old software. Did they actually also look at the security problems, or did they introduce a few more in their urgency to fix the Y2K bug? Because that's often what I also see, is that one problem triggers the next. Because, oh, we really have to rush now and fix things, and then they don't. But I'll leave it, I think, to Peter to talk a bit more about that.
So maybe that's a good opportunity to go to Peter, who's our last presenter here. Then we'll throw open the floor again.
Okay, thank you. I have little to present except the imaginary quotes around the "we need standards," which is usually a response to cybersecurity challenges. And since all the emotional comments have already been made, I can add another one to this NIST directive thing. So there's this old story of the parents preparing the milk on the oven and then instructing the kid to watch when the milk boils over, and then they leave the house. They come back, it stings really badly. And they approach the kid. What happened? Well, it was exactly 5:30 when the milk boiled over. So that is the reporting thing being put into precision, and that's exactly what is kind of happening and should not be encouraged. The secret instruction or the implicit instruction was, of course, to prevent things from happening instead of doing the precise reporting. And I guess that's another aspect of putting the wrong incentives in place. But enough bashing on the NIST directive and everything around that. So when in the technical community, we do a lot of things. We develop standards. They're implemented, and then things are operated. And I would like to draw some attention to the role of standards in the technical community, like technical standards. We know there are standards of behavior. We sometimes even comply to them. But when we talk about standards in security and in the technical environment, what is the role of standards? Why do we have them in the first place? And it's important to remember that these are first and foremost to ensure interoperability, so that different systems doing the same thing can talk to each other and understand each other, so that they, the syntax and the semantics, the meaning of the packages and the messages exchanged is interpreted equally on both sides of the communication channel. There are, of course, at least when we look at the standardization organizations that are most important for the internet, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force and the W3C and a couple of others more recently, there are also mandatory security considerations, so that when standards are developed, protocols are developed, that the engineers and other people involved not only look at the cheapest or easiest solution, but also take into account security issues that might be buried somewhere deep in the intricacies of the protocol. But even if those considerations are applied in developing the standard, and the standard is something that describes how bits and bytes go back and forth on the wire, even if they are like adhere to these considerations, that doesn't necessarily make safe and secure products, because there's more than that. These standards usually address the implementer, because most of what we talk about here is dealt with in software. Of course, you can do some things in hardware, but then that's the hardware manufacturer or the chip manufacturer, for example, as we've seen Patrick's example of doing NTP solutions in hardware for acceleration, of course. Anyway, so these standards usually address the manufacturer, the implementer, and there are lots of opportunities to do things right, but there are also lots of opportunities to miss the point to a certain extent. No software is actually bug-free. We know that. So good standards may still result in software with bugs, software with deeply buried bugs, and software with bugs that are only discovered ages after the software has been first deployed. And this is one aspect that bites us very badly with the Internet of Things, for example, with some of these devices that are attached to a wall and then left alone for a couple of years, and after that nobody remembers how to fix software, for example. There's also some dependency. So usually software isn't built from scratch. People use so-called libraries, that is like building blocks from other places that they use in their software. And of course there are dependencies. These building blocks could have bugs, and these bugs can have consequences in one implementation but not in another. That is, so even if a library has been in use for ages and never triggered a significant incident, you use this library now for some other product, for some new protocol, for some new implementation of a new protocol, and it turns out that there is a bug in that library, in that software piece, that isn't really easily identified because it's somewhere deep in the code, and bad things happen. Now, finding out what the real issue and what the origination of the bug is really hard, and it's even harder to fix this. Much of the success of the internet, I should say, is based on open source software. We've heard before that this gives everybody the opportunity to review the code. Good luck. In the earlier days, when we had less code, many people actually did that. There were code reviews, and people would actually be involved in developing the code further anyway. That was the small core of the internet then. So bugs would turn out sooner or later. More recently, we've had bugs in widely used security software even that surfaced all of a sudden, wasn't discovered before, and it turned out, yes, even though everybody had the opportunity, in theory at least, to review the software, that hadn't happened. So open software is a big chance, a big opportunity, but there, of course, needs to be money and other investment to actually check the security of that software, and that is something that needs to happen, that can be organized without sacrificing or jeopardizing the basic ideas of open source software. So that needs to go hand in hand. And again, a little about standards here and some other things. Oh yes, talking about fixing software. So ages ago, there was a new version of software every now and then. For some reason, you were usually incentivized patching software or deploying a new version because of new interesting features. These cycles have changed these days. Software has quicker release cycles, but not everybody is actually applying those patches. Sometimes you don't even have a license for the software. We have similar challenges. Now, we have these new functions in there that are like two-handed or two-bladed swords, like automatic updates. That sounds great solution to a problem. So you can just install software. It will phone home every now and then and install and fix itself. I usually turn off this function. I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody else to do that, but there are reasons for doing that. I'm paranoid, that's one thing. I'm not the only one, hopefully. The other is that there are some... You are in situations where you don't want the software to waste your bandwidth updating several megabytes while you are on a very, very low bandwidth link. Other people deactivate that for other reasons. The important point is, of course, to then do manual updates and get things deployed and fixed quickly. And the other problem is, and that's the paranoid part, many people don't trust the vendors, because not only do the software pieces phone home for updating, but they all report interesting things that you've been doing, and many people don't like that. So the part of the industry has actually disincentivized people from doing the right thing and keeping their software updated. Another observation from that is that bugs could be spread by this easily, and you have a big population out there, big swarm of software, installed software. You release a new software, and the bug is out there. And usually you would think, oh yes, but the next update cycle will actually get the software fixed. And a strange observation is that the disease spreads really, really quickly, but the vaccine usually doesn't follow in the same way for some weird reason. So we can spread bugs easier than we can spread the fixes. I leave the scientific proof to somebody else, but this is in the time of whatever news. So, and a final thing about the whole suite of standards is, I guess, complexity in that environment. We have more and more standards, we have more and more details in standards, more and more software to deploy and to fix. And interestingly, we see that old mistakes are repeated. We've just heard from Marco that basically the same security holes have been exploited over and over again. But we also see in newly deployed software bugs or misinterpretation from standards that have been thought to be overcome but haven't. Part of this is probably due to new players entering the field. Again, not blaming the Internet of Things, but pointing to it. There's a couple of new industries actually discovering the Internet and bringing software into the Internet that haven't done that before. And they have a very, very steep learning curve. I'm not jealous. And that is one of the reasons that we see old bugs popping up again. Okay, so that's like setting the scene, standards, technical standards. We need to look at implementers. And finally also, standards usually have certain parameters that are left open either to the implementers, so they have, I wouldn't say ambiguities, but opening clauses, as probably people in the legal sphere would say, opening clauses so that implementers have some leeway for decisions, but also more importantly, these products leave parameters open for the operator. That can be a professional operator, but could also be the home user, to twist the software and enable or disable features or set parameters like temperature, the strength of the light, or something like that. And sometimes the standards bodies can actually give recommendations how you choose these varying parameters, like timeouts. How long would you wait until you decide that the clock that Patrick operates has gone wild and you need to switch to the other clock? But not always the standards body is in the position to do that, because standards developers are not necessarily the same folk that operates these things, and then there's more experience in the operators group. So that's another part of the technical community that needs to be involved in developing these guidelines. And all of these together, like the standards, the implementation, and then operators need to work together to get the whole system secure. And that's it.
Take it away, Marco.
Yeah, with the odd chance of actually stepping on your on your toes and sliding into a moderator chair, but you've mentioned something really important, and I want to hook up with that, and that's sort of kind of the message that bugs are unavoidable, and to rudely drag it out of context. More is less, and I know that in the security field, one of the solutions then is to go multi-vendor. You add redundancy if you know the vulnerability exists. We'll put another system in place. We've seen that with Patrick. We put 2 clocks next to each other, so in case one of them breaks down or is tampered with, I've got another one. Crucially, I noticed in the picture they're exactly the same. There is no multi-vendor there, so if one of your clocks has a bug, the other one also has this issue. And care to explain and then sort of bring it to the educational point of this session? How?
Yeah, so just because of that reason, the way the system is designed, it's actually part of the agreement that you sign up with us if it is the case that you pick up time with PTP, is that, which is what most sort of cell phone operators do. It actually says in the contract, and this is part of the regulation in Sweden, that you are not allowed to use the PTP from us as the only source. You must, by definition, use another source. So the goal with the regulator and the Swedish government to give money to us to run this is to ensure that everyone has 2 different sources, not only one. So it's not to give people one source, it is to give people the second. That's what we are doing.
And to add to that, yes, multi-vendor is a good idea. You can take it to the extreme, but then of course you increase the operational complexity because you need staff to operate various flavors of systems that have rare occasions anyway. And the other problem is that, pointing back to that library, finding products that have a complete disjoint set of software, including all the libraries down there, is really, really difficult. But in general, I would support your advice.
Okay, so as I said, Peter was the last of our sort of arranged speakers, and we have about half an hour left in this session, which is very much what we planned. I do want to basically throw the floor open, and I want to say, obviously, any questions you have or comments relating to any of the points our speakers have made here today would be great. But this is an educational session on cybersecurity issues, and as I said, there's been a lot of cybersecurity discussion in the news and sort of in the air recently. So this is an opportunity as well for any other questions you have that might cut to sort of technical realities of what these cybersecurity problems are, to bring it to, well, essentially a group of experts here we have available to you. So the floor is very much open. And start here.
Hey, Tapani Tadmanen from Electronic Frontier Finland. Just wanted to point out on this multi-vendor thing, it's also a double-edged sword. If you have 2 different solutions, the likelihood that one of them will fail is of course bigger than one of them will fail. And whether that is good or bad depends. For example, think of maybe you put 2 firewalls in a row. The chances of both of them having a hole that someone can get through is much smaller, but chances that one of them has a DDoS hole that can be used to disable the thing is bigger. So it depends on the context whether you should have multiple or one solution.
If you have 2 firewalls and you do announcement from sort of both of them, if it is the case that you detect that you have an issue in one of them, you withdraw the route announcement from that firewall and you have all the traffic redirected to the other one. So the good thing in that case is that you have 2 different firewalls from 2 vendors that both are in place. So yes, you get attacked, and yes, there is a higher risk, of course, with pure statistics. But on the other hand, when you have an incident, it might be the case that it's an advantage to have the second, an alternative already in place. So I completely agree with you. But this is also, and I wanted to expand on this, on what you said, just to also explain to the other people in the room that this is exactly how you have to think about redundancy, uptime, make sure that things work. Should you go with multiple vendors, increase the complexity. In our case, we run exactly the same hardware and software on all our nodes. 2 different vendors on each node for certain things, but otherwise the same vendor. And instead, the people that buy our service have to go to a different provider than us. That's the redundancy, and that's where we have. So the important thing for people that buy services from each other, because that's what we do all the time, is that we tell everyone else how we have designed our systems so that the other party can make informed decisions.
I wonder if there's anything else. Otherwise, I've got a question for the room. As I was jokingly saying to Patrick, is like, are we going to offer to fix their computer? Patrick made a point of openness. We're here. We're happy to look into your problem. Anybody? Any bringing security questions that we can answer?
Not security question, but just comment on previous thought on open source software. There are a couple of initiatives out there, like HackerOne or Open Security Bounty, who are actually looking at open source in that sense. But in other sense, to be blunt, there are many vendors who box open source software without telling you that they are using open source components. And in that sense, I would consider it to be worse in some sense, because they, in that sense, don't contribute back to community and actually don't give you ability to realize that you might be vulnerable to some open source component vulnerability that is actually affecting general public at the current time.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think that you're partly referring to initiatives that have been follow-ups to the incident that I spoke about regarding this OpenSSL library. One point I'm not sure I got correctly here is that also vendors that ship closed source software can make you vulnerable. So the vulnerability isn't a feature of the open source nature of the software, but I would agree with what you said about the contributing back. Depending on what the license is, license model of the open source software and so on and so forth. But my point there was that the illusion that everybody could look into it doesn't automatically lead to anybody really doing that or that being done in a sufficient way. And when more and more critical infrastructure, critical in quotes or not, is relying on software, open or closed, that software needs closer inspection no matter what. So yes, complete agreement.
I think you've got a mic right next to you.
Yeah, during Peter's presentation, when he's speaking about the idea of automatic updates and vendor patches, I was reminded of a case, I think it's still ongoing in the Netherlands, where a consumer association was suing a software vendor because a software vendor decided they would no longer provide patches for software that was 10 years old. And I was wondering that from the panel's perspective, whether you think that a provider of software should be mandated by law to, for as long as a piece of software is viable, to automatically give out free patches, or whether that's even commercially technically feasible for providers to do.
I leave the answer to Patrick, but just to provide context, because I do know which case you're referring to, that was consumer organization suing a large phone manufacturer for not releasing any new software updates for models older than 2 years. As I recall, the judge put that complaint aside. There was basically said like, yeah, that's apparently based on the EU, some general EU directives is 2 years was enough, and tough luck. It's their choice. You're not paying for it. I think was sort of the reasoning for that case. But I'll leave it to Patrick to give you an answer.
Well, I think there are two aspects that we have to remember. One is the pure commercial aspect. What is the responsibility of a vendor that delivers something to the consumer? And that's consumer rights issues to a very large degree. And going to comment on another part of this story, I think. The reason why I think open standards are important is not so much whether they follow standard or not. I think what is important is that various equipment and various services are what I call replaceable. Because if it is the case that a vendor misbehaves, which might be the case in this case, at least from the consumer organization's perspective, the vendor was doing the wrong thing. Yes, that is something you have to deal with in court, but what is much, much more important than that is that the end user can choose a different phone. Because the way out of that is just to buy another kind of vendor. So that's why, for example, I think directives, for example, that makes it possible for the end user to, for example, an FTTH connection, to be able to connect whatever CPE you want, and not only one that brings you the internet connection, is much more important. Because if it is the case that you as a consumer is screwed up and you get some gear that doesn't work, it is really, really important that you can go down to the shop, buy something from a different vendor and connect it yourself. So we have to talk about different kind of things here. And I think we should not forget the replaceable part of this, because having the ability to at least get out of the mess that you're in is actually, from what I claim, a security standpoint and resilience standpoint, actually really, really important. But then, of course, we still have this other thing which we cannot forget, which is what is the responsibility for a vendor to ensure that something continues to work, even sort of over longer periods of time. So there are both of these aspects we need to think about. Replaceability is something that I think is very, very important.
So I have one question which I think comes back to the issue of standards and sort of, Peter, you mentioned just in passing almost the growing complexity of the sort of, I guess, web of standards and different standards and protocols. And I guess we're certainly very aware that more and more we're seeing sort of mobile operators come on. We're seeing IoT as sort of something that's happening. Standardization isn't now happening in a sort of single place like the IETF. There's a lot of other standards that have come out of, whether it's 3GPP or GSMA, IEEE, any number. Is that complexity of those standards having to work together, is that a sustainable model? Is that something that is going to sort of make it too difficult to actually solve security problems or foresee even what the security problems are going forward?
That's a very good question, which usually is the diplomatic version of really difficult. So I try to give two responses, but I'd also invite the other panelists to chime in here. I think that partly the sphere of standardization is partitioned in a way so that the 3GPP and others are more down to the wire and to the radio ways actually than like the IETF is. It is important to get a common understanding of the standards bodies, that they have their spheres of activity and don't overlap too much, so that nobody steps on others' toes, and more importantly, that the expertise isn't like scattered around. So we know that things that are core internet protocols will be dealt with in the IETF, for example, and things that are happening above the HTTP, like the web layer, is happening in W3C. And whatever is radio waves, there are different organizations, ETSI in Europe and others. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also this Open Stand initiative of standards bodies that actually agreed upon things like that. The IEEE is involved, if I remember correctly, so that it is clear that for certain ideas and certain standardization projects and efforts, these things are going to the right place, and where there are overlaps, that the standards bodies actually cooperate in ways of liaisons like the IETF does with also the ITU, and the IEEE and others. Not sure that responds, but...
I think it goes back to, one way of looking at it is it goes back to what I just said about replaceability. That today, it's sort of, it's not so much up to us as a user what kind of standard is in use. Standards, we have to remember, are products on the market, and the vendors choose what standard they want to use. Just look at the IoT thing, that there are like, I know approximately 5 different consortia which claim they are dealing with whatever IoT standards, and then IKEA is choosing their own path forward anyways. So for example, light control. So I think the problem for us consumers is that I want a wall switch, I want a thermostat, and I am so far away from choosing what standard is in use. So it's just, you cannot even think, you don't even know whether Wi-Fi or a SIM card in the device. I buy a car and there's a SIM card in there. I cannot even change the mobile operator. It goes over to sort of, I use the Facebook service that I can only get from the company Facebook. I cannot choose a different provider of the Twitter service than Twitter, which is completely different than web and email, where I can choose who should be my mail provider, and I can even run my own mail server. I can do that for Twitter. And the big question for us, I think, as consumers, is whether we want the Facebook-like world where you get the thermostat from the thermostat vendor and it's up to them how they implement the communication, or if it is the case that I run a thermostat which is more the email version where I can choose what client I use.
But I fully agree with you, but I do then see the looming problem of liability and responsibility, because if I can give you the standard, but usually the security problem is in the way the standards get implemented. It's about writing code, and the more access I give you, the more faults you seem to introduce. I'm now looking at random people. I'm not even sure if you're writing code, but that sort of seems to be the overall problem with cybersecurity, is that everybody is an expert, and I greatly agree with that in terms of Patrick is make us replaceable. So yeah, I would rather see you all becoming an expert. But
I'd like to follow up again on Patrick's comments here that we have an interesting case of trade-off. If we have a Facebook type environment, it's like monoculture in agriculture, just everybody using the same thing. It's better protected, more likely than any in this spread out scenario, but if it breaks, it hits everybody. Whereas if we have a distributed system, people using their own little different mail servers, then it's much more likely that something breaks, but much less likely that everything breaks. So that's a trade-off we have to make, and in the long term, I tend to think the latter is better. Have lots of little failures every now and then, taking the risk of a total disaster at some point. But it's not an easy decision.
Okay, looking around, do we have any other? Yep, we have.
Well, to get back on the legacy topic, I recently we had a discussion on how secure are old keys. So I understand access to all systems are, of course, secured by keys of a given length, and no vendor will overdo. If not, there is no necessity to use too complicated keys. I remember when 40-bit keys were something that was under US export control. Now, isn't it so that almost any key within 10 years' time, max, will be just ludicrous, given the possibility to break it by brute force?
Okay, just like Peter, I'm saying that's a difficult question to answer. Let me explain a little bit what has, from my perspective, not being a crypto person, what has been going on back and forth. But I have been working with DNSSEC just like I did with Peter. Peter has, though, been thinking much more about the theory behind this, so I hope that you can correct me or fill in some blanks here when I'm trying to explain where I am. First is that some people think that sort of keys got worn out over time, and which is wrong. Whether you have to replace your key or not has to do with the evolution of computation, just like you're saying. How many prime numbers can you actually calculate on a computer within a certain amount of time? And one of the reasons why, so there are basically, from my perspective, from a pure math perspective, there are two reasons for changing the key. One is that you have CPU power enough to actually do calculations that you need. The other one is that you get weaknesses of various kinds, like collisions in the MD5 checksum and other kind of things. That means that you have to move over to other algorithms because you find weaknesses in the actual algorithm itself. There are in reality no other real reasons to change the key. So for example, in DNSSEC, I was one of the persons that originally said, yes, it's really important that we rotate our keys. Now we see, well, wait a second, it's probably more complicated to rotate keys than actually keeping them, so the KSK can actually be kept for a very long time. That said, one thing that is really important to do is the day when you have to change the key, you need to know how to do it. It's like you don't know whether the backup actually worked unless you try to restore it and you see that it didn't. So for pure operational reasons, I see a good thing to actually rotate keys to be able to know how to do it, etc., etc. Who in this room have had problems when your certificates of your web server run out? Yes, exactly. And you don't remember really how to buy, you have to reinvent how to buy a certificate every time it happens. It's like, damn, if this happened every month, I would know how to do it. I would automate it. Now I have to do it manually instead. So I see 3 reasons to rotate a key. To keep your operations up to date so you know how to do it, so it's normal labor that you do just like having lunch. 2, that the evolution of CPUs are such that computational, for computational reasons, or that there are weaknesses in algorithms, otherwise there's no reason.
Brief interruption. Top tip, if you are running DNSSEC, have a chat with our colleagues from ICANN, because that day Patrick described is somewhere this summer.
Yeah, I'm not trying to correct Patrick, but just maybe adding one angle or one perspective to this. Well, keys can be used for different things, like for authentication, as in a digital signature, or in encryption, like keeping information confidential. And especially for information that needs to be kept confidential and should be kept confidential over a long period of time, the key needs to be in a shape or form that is length, that is considered safe until the end of that time, like 30 years or something, depending on what your requirements are. And then you might consider like rekeying and getting rid of all the copies and so on and so forth. But everything else I'd probably agree with. So discussion about key length and security and so on and so forth always needs to take into account what the key is actually used for, and the different applications have subtly different requirements. Yeah, that's it.
So what I gather from these answers is, actually, yes, there is an issue with it, and actually something should be done, but most probably non-pros, they have at least a big chance to mix things up if things don't work. So wouldn't that be something that should be taken into account for public education to a much higher degree? In particular, just encryption and switching passwords?
Now we're going to switching passwords now, which is slightly different from choosing keys. And I think switching passwords, I think a weak password is a weak password, a strong password is a strong password, just like the same thing with keys and key length, depending on what you're using them for. So I would say it's much more important to, first of all, make people actually use DNSSEC and validate DNSSEC, and use encryption, use hardware keys, use two-factor authentication stuff, and use good passwords. It's much more important that people use good passwords than they rotate their passwords. So rotate passwords, that was something people talked about like 10 or 15 in the previous millennium. We don't anymore. We talk about choosing good passwords.
I'm absolutely no crypto expert. It's impossible to. I understand the high level things, and again, I think it's also part of the educational point is behavioral. This morning, Michael already flagged it. Tomorrow, talking a bit about sustainability and e-waste. Part of that is, should you really have that information lingering around for 20 years when there is a possibility that your key is being broken, or should we, as Marjolein said, this is a collaborative effort in educate people also in making sure that that information is not lingering around in the first place. As Peter said, if you need to keep it for 30 years, and plan ahead. But in what I see around me, a lot of these issues just exist because people don't plan ahead. And actually, yeah, what is a credit card transaction that's 2 years old worth? Well, not much until I find it and see that the credit card is still valid for another year. Crazy enough, my bank now gives me credit cards that are valid until 2030. Talking about rollovers, that's also the different topic. Don't find my credit card.
They've probably found a way to make you liable for the losses. Anyway, chiming in on the password thing. Passwords are so yesterday anyway, but everybody's using them for a variety of reasons. And pointing back to the rants about organized security or security standards, many security standards will say, thou shalt have a password policy. And then people start running out and running around having password policies, and sometimes there's still this rollover password and so on and so forth. And that was a good idea at its time, except that it completely ignored the human factor, because what happened was that people were like confronted with, you now have to change your password. And they immediately changed their password, and of course that wasn't a good password. Now, some of the policies have adopted, and then they try to dictate or encourage the user to choose a good password by explaining to them that it needs to have a digit, an uppercase, a lowercase letter, a special character, and so on and so forth. From an attacker's perspective, that is helpful because they now know a bit more about the password than they would otherwise. Yeah, and the average user is a bit challenged. The most important thing about this is that use your password. If you still use passwords, and there are some occasions where you can't get around them, never use a single password in two different venues. Don't reuse them. That's the most important part. Now, what we all do then is that we have a password vault on our system, and we have the derived passwords. And what do we do if the smartphone is stolen and somebody gets access to that? So there is no real good solution. But the real point here is that, yes, access to systems and end-user access to systems is a very important part in the puzzle of network security.
Yeah, I just want to mention, and looking at Dick here as well, and many of you that have the same thing as we do at NetNode, I got the question earlier, so what happens if people compromise the clocks? And our password policy for many of our systems is that you are not allowed to use a password. Instead, we have various different kind of hardware mechanisms that actually locks people in and out. So you can simply not access it. So if it is the case that you are using certain systems, passwords are not allowed.
So we have a, I think, remote question.
Yes. We have Albert from Spain. He's a PhD candidate at the HK Polytechnic University. And he has a question about, I would like to put, and I quote him, I would like to put an example. I think this was like an earlier discussion. A private company wants to provide XYZ service in a country, in example, global gaming industry. What agents do they have to consider, and who governs their network? Management versus players? What standards do they have, and who is behind them? I hope this is still relevant.
Always.
It's a difficult one. Which agents do you consider? Largely also depends on the country. I think that's some countries have much more strict regulation than others when it comes to the situation of online gaming. You most certainly also want to get paid, so you probably have some requirements from tax authorities and financial sector, the bank handling your payments. This really is a very complex world, and I guess indeed that most of them have different standards, and some people say, and that's often the case also. So where you see like privacy. On one hand, we always, when we have any security discussions, privacy is a concern. But on the other hand, a lot of security discussions are focused around retaining data. And at that meta level, that's always a trade-off. Not sure we are here in a position to make a decision on that trade-off. I think that everybody should make that decision for themselves, but it's really high level. Yeah, when building a gaming service, I don't know, Patrick, you any low-level ideas apart from making sure that the time on all your game services in a reasonable accuracy? I was always told gamers are always high on latency, so that's.
Yeah, the whole stock market is a big game, right? So yes, no. I think you're absolutely right, and we now go into those areas where you have sort of cross jurisdiction, and you have services provided cross-boundary and all different kind of things. It's kind of messy, just like we mentioned with the NIS directive, that it's supposed to be easy. Directives are supposed to be easy to implement in all the member states, but we see that the implementation of the Electronic Communication Directive is different enough between the member states, so implementation of the NIS directive ends up being sort of different. And then if we go into gaming, oh my lord, that's really complicated. Specifically coming from Sweden, I can tell you that, because Sweden has specific legislation on online gaming, as you know, in Finland.
I just had a little story on the related issue of sometimes too much security becomes a problem. I had a case where sysadmin changed the encryption key and then accidentally died before he could tell it to anybody. And the data was never recovered.
Yep, that has happened. I've been in a few of those cases, and it's very tragic, and it's just one of those reasons where you really have to plan for all different kind of things, and planning for key people sort of passing away and other kind of things is part of resilience of a company. It's not easy to write those. When I started at NetNode, one of the first things I did was to look through the policy for the company and make sure that the staff had an ability to continue to run the company, even though I myself personally did not exist anymore. And actually writing that policy is kind of scary, but it's something you have to do.
Okay. As the counting box in Patrick's particular way of explaining it, I'm noting that we're about 3 minutes from the end of what this session should be. I guess probably I was going to offer our 4 speakers here the opportunity to maybe give any final thoughts in case they wanted to summarize what they've been saying.
I can start. I think we have been talking about a couple of different things here. I think it's important to think about replaceability, redundancy, use different vendors. Make sure that you know how each one of the vendors of services you use, how they implemented things, so that you can do informed decisions. And this is one of the reasons why we at NetNode explained, just like I did, how our time services works. So when you use our NTP or our PTP services, you can choose based on your context whether you're going to use us, another provider, etc., so that you get the highest quality that you need.
I often jokingly say, like with a lot of these discussions, the cause of the problem is never in the room. It's always somebody outside. I think one of the takeaways should be is look beyond the complexity. Cybersecurity is a tremendous, complex problem. It also sometimes has very simplistic solutions. That clock that Patrick is building is a really complex solution, but in the end, what you are facing as a consumer is a relatively simple solution. You get a time from him, you get a time from somebody else. And it can be as simple as that. And we just spun around a bit with passwords as well. You can write a very complex password policy, but usually that's overdoing it. Less is more. And indeed make sure also you are replaceable. Yes, just for the sake of redundancy.
Don't stop learning. Don't stop teach yourself. And I steal this from you. It's no longer okay to understand how the internet works.
Yeah, so security is like a live organism that demands continued attention and also likes to be treated like something living, as in attention, and don't let the human factor be ignored.
Okay, so as the tens of thousands of nanoseconds tick by, I'll bring this to a close and thank the speakers we had here today. Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your questions and comments, and enjoy the rest of the event.
And we'll be around if you have any other questions.